Hello and welcome to Hangouts and Headlines. We're here again to talk about something of no particular consequence and that will surely not be controversial at all. And that is, of course, executive powers in the United States, the presidency, and how the media covers them. So I'm very happy to have you all here with us today. If you're not familiar with Hangouts and Headlines because we haven't done one in a month or two, I don't blame you for that. But we start out with the Hangouts portion. We check in with the audience, see where everybody's at, how they're feeling, if anybody has any comments or concerns about the story we're about to talk about. And then we get into it in the second section. If you're watching this in replay, you'll be able to see, hopefully, if I did my job right, some chapter stops distinguishing between the Hangouts and Headlines portions. And then we get into talking about how the media is covering this. And this particular issue, we've got a lot of articles to go over, a lot of concepts to go over, and quite frankly, a lot of virtual legality to go over, a lot of law to talk about, and a lot of details to dive into. So I hope you're excited about all of that. I'm excited to be talking about it with you. Please check in if you're in the chat, if you're in the comments live. Let me know how you're feeling, what time zone you're in, how the weather is, whatever else you want to talk about. I love hanging out with you, and I'm sorry I'm not doing this more often. One of the things I'm trying to do is to find a time and place where it makes sense to do these episodes on a more frequent basis. So I hope you're excited about that. If you're not, I apologize. You probably shouldn't be here. But either way, I'm happy to be doing this, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you. So let me know. Inigo says, hello from Colorado. See, you're doing it right, Inigo. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to be talking to Colorado, amongst other places, including the UK. Good morning, Weird Sister, or good afternoon to you. I'm very happy to have you here. Nice Maleficent profile there. Kelly C says, good morning. Puts a picture of a Hoeg mitten in there. I don't think StreamYard picks that up correctly, but that's all right. Good morning to you, Kelly. Good morning, says Cinnamon Girl 2. Very exciting today. Lots of people pumping in, even though we haven't had an episode in a long time. I'd love to see that. Thank you so much. Morning from Massachusetts. I'm in Louisiana, hoping the storm in the Gulf goes away. I hope so too. Storms are no fun. We just had a big one in Michigan the other day. Lots of bad weather around the country. I hope everybody is safe. Good morning from Southern California, Southern Florida. See, I'm so used to saying Southern California. It's where my wife is from. Good morning from Southern Florida, just because. Good morning to you. Fantastic, everybody. Good to see you here. I hope you're excited about this conversation. We're going to keep it in the Reasonable Minds Can Differ venue, even though we're going to be talking about things that people have a lot of feelings about. So please do stick with us and do try to keep it civil in the comments. I know Against the Tide is here. Asked me a question earlier about how we might handle political conversation because this is an area of some controversy. Do your best, folks. Reasonable minds can differ. There's going to be a lot of reasonable minds differing very greatly, I think, on a lot of what we're going to talk about today. But thank you for being here, even with that understanding. Astrid says, good afternoon from Erlangen, Germany. It's partly sunny, mostly cloudy, and sometimes rainy day here. Well, good afternoon, Germany. Nice to see you, Astrid. I hope you are excited about conversing with us about what is essentially a United States political issue, but I think we can dive into what it means for the media across the world, because this is an issue that popped up to me because of the way this was being reported on more than anything. That's why it is a Hangouts and not a virtual legality. Inigo says, thank you to Just Because. We've got some emojis happening here, and we've got some people gifting out some memberships. Thank you so much for that. Let me see if I can still remember how to find these things. Just Because, thank you for being a member for so long. I appreciate that. And thank you for gifting 5 Hoeg Law memberships today. I really appreciate that. I appreciate all the support that comes to the channel. If you do have any questions or comments that you want to make sure get seen, Super Chat is the best way. Please don't feel obligated to do that. If you also tag Hoeg Law in those things, I tend to see those a little bit more often as well. As people who are here regularly know, when I get going, reading the articles and otherwise talking through these issues, I sometimes don't look at the chat as much as you might see from other streamers or other YouTubers in general. I apologize for that in advance. One of the things I try to do at the end of each episode where I live stream is to answer the questions and comments that come in at that point in time. So if you want to save your questions or comments for a better chance of being seen, please do that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for gifting memberships. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Thank you so much for being here today to have conversations like the one we're going to have. And thank you as well to June B for gifting five more Hoeg Law memberships to the channel. I really appreciate that as well. All of this is fantastic. Thank you so much. I love the Hangouts portion. I love hearing from you all. I'm sorry that I don't get to do it more often. Sue Magic says, good morning. Sunny friends coming in from Boston. Political content completely welcomed from Rick Hoeg, my favorite lawyer. That is very nice of you to say. I'm a little bit saddened for you that you have a favorite lawyer. I feel like no one should have one of those. I'm not sure I do, but I really appreciate the well wishes and the kindness shown to me. So thank you so much, Sue Magic. Amazing Meta says, morning from Kansas. I've missed H&H. I've missed making them. Believe me, one of the things I've been working through is how much appearing on any of these episodes that I do wears me out after the fact, but I want to find a place where I can make the show, have these conversations, and then be worn out for a little bit of time afterwards and not blow up my whole life or my career or anything like that. So I'm working through it. I want to do this more often. Morning to you in Kansas, and thank you for being here. Captain Crunch says, hi, Hoeg. Have a good show, and thanks to Hoeg supporters. Oh, very big thank you to all the supporters. I really appreciate it. Mrs. Hoeg Law is in the chat. If you're interested in talking with her, thanks for being here, everyone. I've got to pop out to do kid things, but wanted to say hi. Yes, this is one of the things that she's fantastic at, and that she does to help make this channel possible is let me sit in here and talk with all of you all while the kids are doing whatever the kids are doing this morning. So thank you very much to Mrs. Hoeg Law. We couldn't do this without you. I really appreciate it. That's why I call her co-counsel so often. Sarnism says, I have many favorite lawyers. None of them are the one I hired when I needed a lawyer. It's fair. It's entirely fair. The one who came in to clean up the mess that one left behind was good, though. Yeah, I do tell people, I tell clients that are either prospective or otherwise talking with me about legal issues that it's important to get it right at the outset because it's much more expensive to clean up things after the fact. And that's just the case. And I'm sorry you had to go through that, Sarnisms. Sarnism says we need a bookshelf tour. I don't know if I can actually give a tour of this bookshelf because I am facing this direction and it's a little bit difficult for me. I'm not the best streamer in the world. I can point to my Final Girls. I have talked about that board game a lot in the past. It's one of my favorite board games ever. So if you're interested in solo board gaming at all, which is not something that I thought I would be interested in, please do check out Final Girl. You take a character through a horror movie environment and try to save as many victims as you can before the evil monster or other killer gets to them. It's a fantastic tactical strategy game. Please do check it out. Other than that, you see that Rob from Lawn Lumber made me my YouTube play button because the one in the corner there is a little bit too reflective to have directly in the light. So I really appreciate that. You see some gifts back here. This chocobo is from a fan of my work on Last Stand Media, and I'm really appreciative of that. And there's so many gifts and nice things that people have sent over the years now that I really appreciate all of them. The rest is mostly law books. You can see the red bindings of those up above. You can see economics books down below. And I think there's some Star Wars books directly behind me. So basically don't ever throw away a book if you're in my family. So we've got books from when I was a kid all the way up through now, really. But I appreciate it. I hope that was a good enough tour. I don't really know what else is back there. I'm going by my binding reading as well as you are here looking at them. But that's what I've got, and I hope that was helpful. Astrid says, I'm excited to discuss, of course. It's always interesting to see what are the opinions in other parts of the world, especially in this case, as it is not reported on in Germany. That's a surprise, actually. This is such a big one. This is one of those that I was thumbing through a couple of days ago when this article that we're about to discuss first went live. And like the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni article, also from the New York Times, that I was reading through this past December, I got about halfway through and said, okay, I have a lot of thoughts about how this is written, what they are saying, what they are not saying. And that's, to me, what makes for a good Hangouts and Headlines. So I should do an episode of that. It was just a matter of whether I could find a time that worked for me and that wouldn't otherwise blow up the rest of my day/schedule. So hopefully this is as informative and exciting and interesting as I hope it to be. Right now, we're still in the Hangouts, I know, but we're going to get to the headlines very shortly. And I think it's going to be a very good conversation. Against the Tide says, Runkle is just as awesome in person. Yes, Tide, you got to meet Ian very recently, didn't you? I think Ian is the only one of the YouTube lawyers that are otherwise in my circle that I have not gotten to meet in person at this point in time. So, Ian, we got to get together at some point. But it's nice that you got to meet him against the Tide, and I'm glad he is just as awesome in person. I was hoping to meet the Hoags. I was disappointed when I found out Michigan was not close to Vancouver. Yeah, pretty much other side of the country. Sorry about that. I should have known. Michael Hendricks, I just wanted to stop by and say anytime I see you in any piece of content, I'm instantly more excited to listen/watch. Well, I really appreciate that kindness, Michael. I am hopeful that we have a good conversation here today. I think we will. I'm really excited about this one. And it's nice to hear such kindness. Some of the stuff that I do in the obviously more controversial world of video game commentary doesn't get received quite as well as the less controversial politics or law conversations that I have here. So it is nice to get that positive affirmation from time to time. Not saying you should just live on the affirmations of others, people, or internet comments, what have you, but I am, like so many others, only human, and it is nice to hear kindnesses from time to time. Henhouse Bathco says, hanging with Hoeg on my 48th birthday. Happy birthday, Henhouse Bathco. Great start to the day. I hope so. We're going to have fun. Tide says, I was so disappointed that they weren't able to meet with me because Southeast Michigan is not particularly close to Vancouver, Canada. So I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you, Tide. I'm glad you did get to hang out with Ian and others. I know we're at that particular meetup. So I apologize for not being closer to Vancouver. This is Midwestern in me, right? I'm apologizing for issues of continental geography. But I work on that, continue to work on that. No apology, Tide. I do not apologize for Michigan not being closer to Vancouver. I take it back. Astrid, over here, the most discussed topic is a judge who might be appointed to the German equivalent of the Supreme Court. She expressed controversial views on abortion, allegedly, so no time for Biden. Teeth, anger, cringe emoji. I don't know how to describe that one. Gritted teeth, I suppose. Nice. All right. Well, folks, I think we're caught up on everything, including a brief background tour of my office as it stands at present. I think it's about time to get into the articles. So let's make sure I've got everything set up the way I want it. And then we'll pull that up on the screen. Again, I will look at comments and questions when I get the chance between topics here. I'm going to try to take it a little bit easier in terms of speediness, but I can tell even from my own cadence right now that probably won't be entirely successful. So please do leave your comments and questions as you have them. Have the conversation in the chat. That's one of the reasons I love a live stream. But if you're especially interested in getting my attention to respond to a comment or question, you may want to wait till the end of the episode because that's when I am most likely to see them. All right. Now, with that said, this was the article I was reading a few days ago from the New York Times that made me pause and say this needed to be a Hangouts and Headlines. Why? Well, let's look at the headline to begin with. Biden says he made the clemency decisions that were recorded with Autopen. Now, there's a couple of things that are happening just in this headline that I want to talk about before we get into the article. The first of which is, what's an Autopen? Why do we care about clemency decisions? Why is this a headline article in the New York Times? That already is what's posed by this headline existing. If you haven't been following any of this at all, we're going to give you some of the background. But what's important from a legal perspective is clemency decisions are what we often see described as pardons. The President of the United States is given power under our Constitution to pardon offenses against the federal government. Importantly, not against the state governments. We run separate jurisdictions here in the United States at the federal level and the state level. So he can't pardon state level offenses, but he can pardon federal offenses. And then this article exists because there must be some question about the validity of the pardoning decisions that he made when they were recorded with Autopen. Now, importantly, we are posed the question, what is an Autopen? And an Autopen, for those of you that don't know, is a mechanical device that allows you to copy your signature across one or multiple documents without signing it yourself, right? So I pulled up this picture from Wikipedia, which is itself a picture from the Library of Congress. But this shows that an Autopen, somewhat unlike a digital signature, and this is going to come up in our later conversation, is a mechanical device that physically takes a pen and signs a piece of paper with it and uses your signature profile to do that so it looks like you signed it. That's an Autopen, and there's some question about whether or not Biden's clemency decisions that were otherwise signed by Autopen were really his. And I say that in that framework because that's an important distinction between what you'll see in this article and what others are describing as the main issue here, which is a bit of a straw man, which we will talk about when we get to that as well. But importantly, as part of this headline, I also noted, and I've highlighted it here for your view, that it says Biden says, which is the framework that a reporter uses when they can't quite verify something themselves, right? And to some extent, this is a whole conspiracy theory kind of viral notion that's out there in the world of social media that President Biden, towards the end of his term, was so cognitively compromised that he could not make decisions on his own. And so there is a question about whether or not he made these particular pardoning decisions that is obfuscated when you allow for the use of a mechanical signing device, right? Because anybody that has the control of that device can make it look like the president agreed to whatever that particular document shows. And so one of the things that we would expect the New York Times to go out there and try to show is not that Biden says he made the clemency decisions, but that Biden actually made the clemency decisions, right? Biden says is a framework you use that's one level below, I can assert the truth of what I want to put in this headline. So I noted that at the top, but I said, okay, maybe they're just being ultra careful, because one other aspect of this article that we will see is that the New York Times did something very odd here, and they've probably done it before, so if you're a regular reader of the Times, I apologize. But they had an interview with President Biden, and this is a separate report of that interview. They're reporting on their own reporting, which is kept in a different article called Excerpts from the Times Interview with Biden on Clemency Decisions. So they got two pieces out of this by essentially having an interview with the president, taking those interview comments, making an article about them, complete with commentary from the Times, and then making an article effectively about that article. But this article that we're about to talk about as our main article here today is the one that raises the most questions in my mind, because it doesn't quite get to what you would expect the New York Times to want to report on this particular topic, which is that Biden made these decisions. Now, more on that as we read the actual substance here, but that's the framework. Okay, towards the end of his term as president, Joseph R. Biden Jr. reduced the sentences of nearly 4,000 federal convicts and preemptively pardoned dozens of politically prominent people he saw as potential targets of vindictive criminal investigations by his successor, aka President Trump. Donald J. Trump and his allies have begun investigations to support their claims that Joseph R. Biden Jr. was incapacitated and his staff conspired to take presidential actions in his name. That sentence is what's important about this entire story, right? We're going to talk about the Autopen. We're going to talk about various people's use of the Autopen. We're going to see other outlets report on the use of the Autopen. What is important about this story is whether or not President Biden, at the time, contemporaneous to his powers in office, made these decisions and then otherwise authorized under his name someone else to execute an Autopen signature on the documents that evidence those decisions, right? There is no legal issue, or at least there isn't a prominent legal issue, with the concept of using an Autopen, using a mechanical signature, or using a digital signature. When we talk about contract law, when we talk about anything in the kind of legally effective genre of questions on topics like these, there's really no major issue with signing something digitally or signing something mechanically. What the law cares about is that the mind that is stating that they are assenting to something, in contract terms, agreeing to the terms of a contract, is the person, the mind, that is otherwise signifying their consent to what is being said in that contract or other document. Said another way, if you're at a diner and you're buying a hamburger and fries, and then you go up and they make you sign the receipt, you don't have to sign it with your signature. You can sign it with a star, your favorite My Little Pony character. You can sign it with a smiley face. You could bring in an Autopen and sign it with an Autopen. What the credit card company and the diner care about is that you assented to pay the amount for that burger and fries that you agreed to, that is shown on that document. So we, as the law side of things, don't care so much about what it actually shows. We don't care about the signature, the mechanics of it. What we care about is documentation that the mind that is saying that they are doing this thing, in this case, I, the President of the United States, am commuting this sentence, or I'm pardoning this person from this offense, that they are the ones that are doing this thing. So as the New York Times rightly says at the top of their article here, what we care about is whether or not President Biden was so incapacitated that his staff was otherwise using the mechanics of the office to make it look like the president was doing things that the president couldn't have known that he was doing, right? That's what matters. And the reason the Autopen matters in this story at all is that it doesn't take too much of a genius to understand that if you allow for the use of mechanical signatures in the course of really important documents issued by the President of the United States, then whoever controls the mechanism to put those mechanical signatures on paper would have, if not the incentive, at least the ability to fake being President of the United States for a little while if they wanted to do so, right? And so that's the conspiracy. That's what is described here by the New York Times as the claims of Donald J. Trump and his allies. What is not so important is just the use of the Autopen in and of itself. That's the straw man we'll talk about more of as we go along. But what the New York Times would be looking for here, as you can see from these various sentences talking about Republican claims and knocking President Trump, et cetera, is some kind of direct line that says, from Mr. Biden, I have made these pardon decisions, and this is officially my action, and I authorize someone to use the Autopen to otherwise document my assent to these things, right? And as a lawyer, again, I want to take one step back and say, this is not something that high-level lawyers at the White House level would not know about, right? This is not something that would surprise a lawyer acting within the Biden administration, that you'd want to be able to properly provide a paper trail showing this specific assent. In my line of work, we get board of directors resolutions, officer resolutions, shareholder resolutions, other contract documents signed by a particular principal. And one of the things that I do is I say, okay, I need to have this signed by you. You can absolutely send it to me electronically. That's fine. But if you send it to me and I get it from your colleague or from your assistant or from someone else that's not you, I'm probably going to follow up and say, I need to see the email where he authorizes you to sign this for him, or I need to see a direct assent email from him. And emails are good enough, right? This is not some kind of belabored process where you have to get it notarized or things like that. You could probably show assent simply through email. And one of the things I would expect the New York Times to be able to produce here as putting together this article is that specific email. So we're going to want to keep our eyes on that as we get to the paragraphs talking about what they can show, because as is already suggested by the Biden says framework of the headline, where it really jumped out as interesting to me was the fact that they don't appear to have that. They don't appear to have that evidence that Mr. Biden has an email that says, yes, put my name on that, sign it with Autopen, let's move on. What they have instead is stuff around that, and that honestly highlights the conspiracy nature of this entire conversation, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this article with you all today. So, continuing from the first sentence of the article, former President Joseph R. Biden Jr. is escalating his battle against Republican claims that he might not have been in control of high-profile clemency decisions issued under his name at the end of his term, and more generally, that his cognitive state impaired his functioning in office. In an interview with the New York Times, again, they're reporting on their own reporting, strange, but you do you, New York Times, Mr. Biden said he had orally granted all the pardons and commutations issued at the end of his term. Pause. All right. So first and foremost, you might hear from various folks that comment on this or other issues that it doesn't count if it's not in writing. There are certain rules in the law that say that if you want to have a contract or other commitment be effective, to be essentially validated by the court system, that it has to be in writing. For the most part, that is not the standard for basically any legal action, whether it's contract or otherwise. You can absolutely assent to things orally, but where the lawyers start to get skittish, where they start to get that heartburn and start being concerned, is if you do something orally and we can't make that paper trail. We can't audit that. We can't show that this decision came from the person that actually had the authority, had the power. And so, yes, Mr. Biden said he had orally granted all the pardons and commutations. That's all well and good. Of course, when the concern is that you didn't know what you were doing at the end of your particular administration, then we're going to need more than, yes, I agreed to all of that as part of the interview answer. We'll get there in just a minute. Calling President Trump and other Republicans liars for claiming his aides had used an Autopen to do so without his authorization. I made every decision, Mr. Biden said in a phone interview on Thursday, asserting that he had his staff use an Autopen, replicating his signature on the clemency warrants because we're talking about a whole lot of people. The interview was Mr. Biden's first about the parallel investigations begun by the Trump White House, the Justice Department, and Congress into a series of clemency decisions made by Mr. Biden in his final weeks in office and his mental acuity during his term. Republicans in Congress have demanded sworn interviews with former Biden aides, prompting them to hire their own lawyers. Some lawyers are said to have warned their clients not to talk publicly about the dangers of testifying because the Justice Department under Mr. Trump might be eager to bring perjury charges over any inconsistency, no matter how minor. Now, again, we can just flatly see some of the political bias in this reporting. I am not the one that's going to sit here on YouTube and otherwise tell you that any given journalistic outlet is not biased. These are written by human beings, same as anyone else. And they, of course, have their own agendas, their own tilts, their own biases. I personally would prefer it if more journalistic outlets did not pretend that they didn't, but that's okay. As long as you can understand that that's happening, you can understand what direction to read these various things in. There is no question in my mind that lawyers are advising their clients to not just offer things up to the Justice Department because they might be eager to bring perjury charges over any inconsistency. That's good legal advice, unnamed lawyers in this article. But the fact that it's the Justice Department under Mr. Trump doesn't really change that. You could have said under Mr. Biden, under Mr. Obama, under Mr. Bush, whoever. You want to be careful about saying things to authorities because those authorities can turn around and use what you say against you. That is, of course, the Miranda rights you hear so often in Law and Order or otherwise when you're watching your favorite police procedural. Anything you can't say can and will be used against you in a court of law, so maybe don't say anything. Mr. Biden's former White House doctor, who has said his medical evaluation showed he was fit to serve, invoked the Fifth Amendment to avoid answering questions from lawmakers last week. Now, that's a strange kind of aside here, and if you pull up that article from the Times, it doesn't really go into greater detail. We do note the date here from this particular article is July 9th, so it's a few days before the rest of this. Presidents have for decades used an Autopen to sign all manner of documents, including major legislation. Doing so is legal as long as the president authorizes it. The important part is, did the person with the power authorize the use of the device? President Trump and his allies have been stoking a theory that Mr. Biden suffered from severe age-related decline that left him incapable of making presidential decisions at all, making any action taken in his name via the device legally invalid. And folks have asked me how this would be prosecuted, how this might look in the future. There is no good answer to this. There has not been an instance in American history that I'm aware of, and maybe there is some case law in the far edges of the legal system in America that answer this a little bit better than I can right here. But there's no instance in history that I'm aware of where essentially the cognitive ability for someone to assent to documentation or actions in the role of president has been questioned by the court system. But for the folks asking me this particular question, how this might look in the future, if there is an issue here, what I would expect is that some enterprising district attorney at probably the federal level, but you could have a state level district attorney that is otherwise seeking to prosecute on federal crimes, looks at some of the pardons, some of the clemency actions, especially those issued very late in the former president's term, and says, well, okay, so technically speaking, if somebody is pardoned, I don't have the authority to prosecute them for what they were pardoned for, but what I can do is I can prosecute them anyway and say, I'm challenging the validity of the pardon action, and then we can go through the discovery process and have that particular battle in court over that question at the time. That's how I see it most likely playing out. I don't think there's a lot of people that otherwise have standing here to argue this particular issue. Standing being, of course, that you were personally damaged in some way that you could bring a claim that there's an issue, right? If these pardons are invalid as a hypothetical, then the country as a whole and the citizens of the country are somewhat damaged by the fact that there are criminals running around that maybe shouldn't be because those pardons really didn't take effect and the justice system otherwise let them out loose upon the world. But that isn't good enough to bring a legal claim in most instances because every citizen in the country would have the same kind of damage, and that's not the kind of thing that you can bring a separate legal action for. But if you want to prosecute one of these people that are otherwise said to be pardoned or have their sentence commuted, then maybe you could bring a claim in the role of lawyer acting for the state, meaning either the federal government or the state government in which you operate on these federal questions. And then the court would have to say, is that pardon valid? I expect in that particular circumstance, the burden on proving it invalid would lay on the prosecutor that's trying to bring the action. So it would be a very difficult case to bring. But again, I'm imagining this as some kind of enterprising political mover and shaker that wants to make a big name for themselves and wants to be in this story going on into the future. So I do think something like that could happen. But where it stands right now, we don't have enough evidence either way. So going back to the original article, the full picture of what Mr. Biden did on pardon and clemency decisions and how much he directed those decisions and the actions of his staff, including the use of the Autopen, may come down to tens of thousands of Biden White House emails that the National Archives has turned over as part of the investigation by the Trump White House and the Justice Department. Those emails contain keywords like clemency, pardon, and commutation from November 2024 through January 20th, 2025, according to people familiar with the matter. Now, we've talked about that in Hangouts and Headlines before. That phrase is used by the news reporters to suggest they haven't the direct information themselves. They've got some kind of anonymous source speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive issue. Whether or not you agree with that grant of anonymity for this purpose is neither here nor there. I'm not sure it really holds up, but we've seen, according to people familiar with the matter, in a lot of instances, you want to, of course, put a pin in that. We can't tell the tilt of those people leaking that. But what's more important for this particular conversation is that the New York Times has been told that what was asked for were emails that contain words like clemency, pardon, and commutation. And we would expect one of those words to trigger something from the president that says, yes, use the Autopen to sign my name on these various things. But the Times' next paragraph says they've reviewed several dozen of those emails, so they have a leaker of some kind, which discussed each of the major grants of clemency that were recorded by an Autopen near the end of Mr. Biden's term. But the Times has not seen the full extent of the email, so it is impossible to capture the totality of information they contain or what else they might show about Mr. Biden's involvement in the pardon and clemency decisions. This is the paragraph where I'm reading it a few days ago and I say I need to do a Hangouts and Headlines, because this is the paragraph where the Times, out of nowhere, starts acting very defensively about what it is they are likely to talk about on this matter entirely. We know that they think Trump and his allies are pouncing on the beleaguered former president. We know from the setup that they are not entirely in favor of that action. But we also know that what the Times says in this second sentence of the paragraph is that, well, we haven't seen everything, so there might be more in there that would help explain what exactly happened. Now, that's fine to cover your butt in terms of what it is that you're about to say about what you have seen. But in this particular context, what it sounds like to me, and reasonable minds can differ, so if you have a different opinion, leave it in the comments, let me know. What it sounds like to me reading this paragraph is that we didn't get an email leaked to us out of the dozens we were able to look at that actually says, I, the President of the United States, agree to X, Y, or Z in terms of pardons and commutations. That's what you'd be looking for if you're the Times. That's what you were looking for to make this story. And what we can say, what we're going to say in the rest of this article does not include that. But to our readers that look at the rest of this article and say, hey, you don't actually tie up the loose ends, you don't actually dot those I's, you don't actually cross those T's, is that we don't know what we haven't seen. Now, a reasonable mind can look at this and say, okay, but you have a leaker. The leaker probably leaked to you what they think are the most beneficial things for their cause. The leakers are going to be ones that are looking to defend Biden on this particular question. So once those emails don't show up in the original leak, we have much more of a logical position to assume that they don't exist at all, which is one of the reasons why your sentence is so defensive sounding in this particular context. That's how I read it. That's what jumped out at me when I was reading this the first time. And as we continue through this article, you will see that the Times, in fact, does not have that silver bullet that says the president is approving these pardons. What they have are interview answers that say, yeah, I approved everything. And they have emails that say that the aides and staff are talking about these various things, but they have no direct line of authority from the President of the United States on this to this particular question, or at least if they have it, they didn't report on it, which would seem to be an odd thing for the article that they are writing. But those that were reviewed by the Times show that the Biden White House had a process to establish that Mr. Biden had orally made decisions in meetings before the staff secretary, Stephanie Feldman, who managed the use of the Autopen, would have clemency records put through the signing device. Asked what evidence the Trump White House has that Mr. Biden did not authorize the clemency actions, a spokesman, Harrison Field, said on Sunday that Mr. Biden should not be trusted, adding the truth will come out about who was, in fact, running the country. Interesting positioning for this particular quote because it makes the Trump administration and his spokespeople sound like conspiracy theorists yelling at the moon or otherwise participating in an X-Files episode of your choosing. And I think that's by design, but it doesn't otherwise fit into the story that the Times is telling here in the article. While Mr. Biden had previously criticized the GOP claims, GOP in America being the Republican Party, that's Trump's party, claims that he did not make the clemency decisions as ridiculous and false in a written statement. He spoke to the Times as he and his team are stepping up efforts to counter the attack by Mr. Trump and his congressional allies. Mr. Trump, asked by a reporter last month whether he had uncovered evidence that anything had been illegally signed without Mr. Biden's knowledge, said no. But he cited his rival's debate performance in June 2024 when Mr. Biden, 81 at the time, delivered halting and meandering answers. Mr. Biden withdrew soon after from his re-election bid. I've uncovered, the human mind, Mr. Trump said. I was in a debate with the human mind, and I didn't think he knew what the hell he was doing. So again, this is an argument about whether or not he had the cognitive capacity to otherwise make these commutations, make these pardons, because the Constitution supposes that the president is an adult human being that can make decisions on their own. And what the Autopen does, and what people that use these mechanical devices and electronic signatures know, is that it opens the possibility of a bad actor stepping in and essentially pretending that they are using the authority of the person with the power. That's the question at issue here. Age-related cognitive decline is a spectrum, says the New York Times, almost out of nowhere. At one end, many older people become more prone to blanking on names or losing their train of thought when speaking at length, but remain able to process information and make reasoned decisions. At the other, some develop profound dementia. So the New York Times here is establishing that President Biden definitely doesn't look like someone who is as sharp as a tack, to use a phrase that was used a little bit during the election year. He doesn't look like that. I don't think anybody that is reasonable can say that he does. But you don't have to be sharp as a tack to still be good enough for government work, as it were, to have enough thought process to be able to use human decision-making and judgment to exercise the powers of the office that you've been elected to. So the New York Times says, look, President Biden might not be all there. He didn't have a great debate performance last June, certainly, but that's a distinction between that and at the other end, some develop profound dementia. Republicans are positing an extreme version, claiming that Mr. Biden was incapacitated. They are speculating that his staff conspired to use the Autopen to make presidential decisions in his name. At the end of his term, Mr. Biden reduced the sentences of nearly 4,000 federal convicts and preemptively pardoned politically prominent people he considered potential targets of Mr. Trump for criminal investigations. Mr. Biden said in Thursday's interview that he had his staff use an Autopen for the warrants because he had granted clemency to so many people. The Autopen was used in all on 25 pardon and commutation warrants from last December to January. It's a lot. Some of the individual warrants included large batches of names because they all fell into the same broad policy category, like reducing the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders who met standards Mr. Biden established. Now, here is another sentence that jumped out at me because I don't think there's an issue particularly with the president saying, I want everybody who was arrested between April 30th of year X and August 31st of year Y to be pardoned because of reasons, or anything else that is actively quantifiable. I don't think there's any problem with the president saying that's the category I want. Tell me who fits that, and we'll just execute the pardon that way. Where there is a concern, however, is if the standards, and most legal standards are not going to be so quantifiable, were a little bit more ambiguous or vague. If it involved any judgment on the part of anyone, it has to be his judgment. It can't be his chief of staff's judgment. It can't be his aide's judgment because he is the only one that has the authority and power to do these things. And so that's one of those things that got highlighted from this sentence is, okay, we're using categories, but did people move around those categories at all? Because I have no doubt that President Biden believes what he is saying in the interview that he gave to the New York Times, that he was entirely responsible for all these decisions. But I also have no doubt that by the time you're talking about thousands of people, it's easy enough for someone that would be a bad actor in this particular instance to squeeze another name on there or to judge a particular circumstance differently than the president himself might have judged it. So when we talk about these things, we're talking about nuance. We're talking about important legal distinctions. We're not talking about, oh, the use of the Autopen itself was illegal. No, it's just that it creates an obfuscating pathway that would allow a bad actor to potentially act badly. And we have to take that into account when we talk about these things. And perhaps in the future, especially if we're going to continue to elect septa and octogenarians into office, we might want to have more specific rules about signing and notarization of things like presidential actions. Those are reasonable discussions to have without going into, oh, Biden was evil and a potato and his staff was just making up names. It clearly does not appear to be the case that the entirety of the concept of these pardons and commutations was invented by the aides. We can see President Biden reacting very strongly to that notion in the New York Times interview excerpts that they provided. But that doesn't mean that everything that actually happened at the end of his term was something that he otherwise assented to. And that's really where the fight is. It's more nuanced than you might otherwise see in social media or being discussed. And that's why I wanted to have this discussion with you today. But do read these interviews. I will, of course, link these in the podcast description of this video because YouTube doesn't like it when I link directly to YouTube. Mr. Trump and his congressional allies are focused in particular on trying to delegitimize Mr. Biden's final batch of clemency actions. They said extended preemptive pardons to many people Mr. Trump perceived as enemies, including General Mark A. Miley, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and members and staff of the House committee that investigated the Capitol riot. Mr. Trump has claimed on social media that the January 6th committee pardons are invalid, asserting without offering evidence that Mr. Biden did not know anything about them. Now, again, we just have different standards of evidence that are being disputed by the parties here, which is to say, the New York Times says there is no evidence that Mr. Biden didn't know anything about them. You heard Trump's quote earlier in this article where he said, look, I debated the guy. He didn't seem to know where he was in that debate. So I can assert that he doesn't know what he's doing by the time we get to the last 2 days of his presidency. And you can argue that Trump is making things up because that's what he wants. That's what he needs. And I can't dispute that sitting here. But you can also argue that the New York Times is perhaps being a little glib by suggesting that he's offering this without evidence. There is evidence that at bare minimum, President Biden was having certain cognitive difficulties towards the end of his term. In the 10-minute interview, which the Times requested as part of its reporting on the investigations, Mr. Biden said he shielded those people, along with members of his family, so they would not have to run up large legal bills from politically motivated investigations by the Trump Justice Department. Here's another flag for me, because when I look at this particular concept, I say, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. In his interview answers, he says, look, I think Trump is a vindictive POS, and so I'm going to make sure I pardon the people that I think his vindictiveness might attack the most, and that's why I did it. But if you are so concerned about the future president being this vindictive and using all of the apparatuses he has to punish you and your family, then this would seem to be the clearest, most necessary circumstance for which you would want to have that audit trail, where you'd want to have that paper trail of what it is that you are doing. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he just didn't care. Maybe he wasn't that cognizant of the risks associated with this kind of thing. But it is notable to me that the one thing the New York Times cannot point to in this article is that email contemporaneous to the decisions being made that says, yes, I, the president of the United States, am deciding to do these things in writing. It's always oral discussions. It's always summaries from other people, including people that weren't in the room, as we will see in just a minute. And that's where we're left with this particular circumstance, which is why even the New York Times has to headline their story on this topic with Biden says and not Biden did. The president makes the final decision. They highlight this particular topic. On October 30th, 2024, the emails reviewed by the Times show Mr. Biden's White House counsel, his chief lawyer, Ed Siskel, notified senior staff to expect a flood of lobbying for clemency grants at the administration's end and laid out a process for an orderly review. The final step, he wrote, the president makes the final decision on the final pardon and or commutation slate. And of course, he's the lawyer. He's the chief lawyer for the White House. This is exactly what a lawyer would say. Look, I know as the lawyer that the president is the only one that has the authority to do any of this. So in emails to the staff, I'm going to say we're going to have this process. We're going to have these policies. We're going to have this procedure. But at the end of the day, only the president can say yes or no to the pardon and commutation slate. So they have that. The New York Times has that. There is a lawyer trying to do things the fully legal, appropriate way in the background. And that's almost where it stops. Over the next 3 months, Mr. Biden made 4 major sets of clemency actions that were recorded with an Autopen. The emails reviewed by the Times included discussions about all 4 batches. Discussions. 3 applied to broad categories of people. He reduced the sentences of inmates sent to home confinement during the pandemic and certain nonviolent drug offenders. And he turned the death sentences of 37 of the 40 federal inmates on death row to life without parole. That echoed the criteria he had used in 2021 when he imposed a moratorium on carrying out federal executions, but excluded death row inmates convicted of terrorism or mass murder hate crimes. In the interview, Mr. Biden explained that he decided against commuting the sentences of the 3 death row inmates. Some thought I should have, but it would have been a bridge too far. The 4th set was announced on Mr. Biden's last day. This is the most controversial set if you weren't following American politics at the time. They included preemptive pardons, which are probably legal for purposes of this conversation. We're not going to get into that topic here. For members of his own family and various people who have drawn Mr. Trump's ire. The emails reflect White House activity surrounding each of those tranches, including the dates of the meetings at which White House officials indicate Mr. Biden made decisions and the names of the senior aides in attendance. So we've got White House officials indicating Mr. Biden made decisions. This is the problem with orally making decisions of this importance, right? At bare minimum, if you're not taking live minutes at the time, if you're not otherwise recording these things in writing contemporaneous to the action being taken, then what you have when you report it to the New York Times is we've got some dates of meetings, and we can indicate that Mr. Biden made these decisions. Mr. Biden says in his interview that he made the decisions, but we don't actually have contemporaneous writings showing that the decisions were his. They also show that the use of the Autopen was managed by Mr. Biden's White House staff secretary, Ms. Feldman. She wanted to receive written accounts confirming Mr. Biden's oral instructions in the meetings before having it used to produce the warrants for recording the clemency actions the emails show. So again, much like the White House chief counsel, the staff secretary here says, look, I'm not just going to use the Autopen to put signatures on whatever pages you put in front of me. I need to see Mr. Biden's oral instructions in writing before I put those Autopen signatures on these documents. But while that sounds like a good policy, we don't actually have those contemporaneous minutes. The aides referred to the written accounts that were requested by the staff secretary as blurbs. The accounts were drafted by aides to the senior advisors who had participated in the key meetings, like Mr. Biden's chief of staff, Jeffrey Zients, and Mr. Siskel, the head lawyer. The assistants who drafted the blurbs were not themselves in the room with Mr. Biden. The emails imply that Mr. Siskel and Mr. Zients relayed what Mr. Biden had said to the assistants, who then documented it. So we've got this kind of attenuated chain of evidence here, right? This is why you don't do it this way for even minor documents. And when you're talking about federal pardons, this is why you definitely would not do it this way in any kind of normal setting. So you can look at this as a conspirator or a conspiracy theorist and say, all right, this is because President Biden isn't cognizant enough to actually assent to these things. So his lawyer and his chief of staff are otherwise telling the aides what was said. And then later on, when the New York Times interviews him almost a half year later, he says, yeah, I agreed to everything because he doesn't know exactly what was done with those documents. That's the conspiracy Trump side of the argument. The other side is this was all above board. We just didn't want to take minutes. We didn't want to do that contemporaneous recording because things were moving fast. We had a lot to do, and that's why we also used the Autopen. Either way could exist, but the fact that you can't show a direct line in writing on these kinds of things to the New York Times, which is a very sympathetic outlet on this topic, makes the conspiracy more likely in my mind, and I suspect more likely in a lot of people's minds who read an article like this one. The assistants circulated the drafts to Mr. Siskel, Mr. Zients, and other meeting participants before sending the final versions to Ms. Feldman, again copying the meeting participants. Presumably the president is one of the meeting participants as described there, but New York Times does not go so far as to say it. For the earlier sets of large-scale clemency actions, the process sometimes took place several days after the meeting with Mr. Biden. So again, when we're seeing what the New York Times is actually reporting here, we have a meeting with President Biden who says, here are the criteria that I'm willing to grant pardons on. And that meeting is not recorded contemporaneously. Instead, his chief lawyer and his chief of staff and maybe other aides that were in the meeting go and tell others that this is what he said. That gets summarized by another party. That is then sent to the person running the Autopen, who signs a document that is presumably drafted by the chief lawyer or someone else. And that winds up being the commutation, that winds up being the pardon. So we're a few steps removed from the power of the president. Some of this is probably necessary insofar as the president does have a lot on his plate. It is a very big job, and there is going to be a certain amount of delegation to others to get those things done. But even the most risk-loving lawyer in the world would say, all right, let's get an assent email on this stuff so that we can make sure that all of this is completely set up if there isn't something else going on. The emails also show that when the White House was preparing to announce clemency grants, communications staff drafted statements explaining the decisions. So one of the things the New York Times is trying to do in this section of the article is say, look, all of these emails were passed around the office. So if somebody were not okay with what was summarized, with what was being done, then they would have every ability to pipe up and say no. The problem is, of course, if you've got staff members or aides or otherwise that are the ones that are using the power unconstitutionally and otherwise wouldn't pipe up because this was something that they wanted to have happen. And this set of affairs, this events as described by the New York Times, allows for that possibility. I'm not saying that happened. I don't know. I certainly wasn't in the Oval Office or the rooms of the West Wing or otherwise when these conversations are taking place. But it leaves the possibility open. And if you're trying to squash conspiracy theories, you definitely do not want to leave large gaping holes of possibility open for anybody to read whatever they want to into it. The New York Times definitely doesn't want that to be what comes out of this story. And yet, to their credit, it seems they're only reporting on what they actually know and leaving these holes of possibility wide open. Mr. Biden did not individually approve each name for the categorical pardons that applied to large numbers of people he and aides confirmed. Rather, after extensive discussion of different possible criteria, he signed off on the standards he wanted to be used to determine which convicts would qualify for a reduction in sentence. Now, this is fine-ish. There's probably going to be a fight on this in the future if somebody's so inclined to take it on, which says, okay, the president has the ability to pardon anybody he wants. It's a full authority from the Constitution. We can look at that right now. As a matter of fact, Constitution of the United States, Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. We know that part. And then Section 2, the president, among other things, shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So the president has that authority, but that doesn't mean that everybody under him can just do what they want with it. And so that becomes the pertinent question here as we talk about this particular issue. And if he did not individually approve each name, can the president just say, everybody who is arrested on these dates or has this other quantifiable characteristic is so pardoned? Yes, I would argue that that's probably good enough as long as there is no intervening human judgment. We talked about that a little bit earlier in this conversation. But the important part is that his chief of staff, his chief counsel, anybody else in the room is not taking what his criteria are and using their own human judgment in some way that isn't otherwise validated by the president, at least after the fact, if not contemporaneous with it. So that's open for debate. We don't actually get the criteria as described in the New York Times article here, specifically put forth by them in this article. So we have to guess as to that. But assuming that it is all quantifiable and it's just essentially looking at data in an Excel spreadsheet, that would be okay. If it's instead something like, I want to pardon everyone that isn't convicted of crimes of moral turpitude, that's a legal phrase that you see a lot in contracts and employment law, then one of the issues is going to be who is deciding what that is, if not the president himself. And that becomes a whole issue, especially when, by his own admission, he isn't agreeing to every individual person on this list. Even after Mr. Biden made the decision, one former aide said, the Bureau of Prisons kept providing additional information about specific inmates, resulting in small changes to the list. Remember, these are people who are going to be pardoned from offenses against the United States. Rather than ask Mr. Biden to keep signing revised versions, his staff waited and then ran the final version through the Autopen, which they saw as a routine procedure, the aide said. Now, I don't know what they're referring to here as keep signing revised versions. We don't have him personally signing anything in this particular story. So I don't know what that means in this context. But more importantly, okay, so he provides the categories and then you say you get more information and then you change the list from approval. We don't have that contemporaneous approval in this article, but assuming that that exists, you don't want to get that contemporaneous approval because small changes are being made. Something doesn't smell right about this entire story at this point. By contrast, Mr. Biden said in the interview he discussed each of the high-profile individuals with aides. He used General Miley as an example. We know how vindictive Trump is, and I have no doubt they would have gone after Mark for no good reason, etc., etc. Mr. Biden completed the list of high-profile clemency decisions over 2 meetings, the emails show. One, on January 18th, included Mr. Zietz, Mr. Siskel, and another aide, Bruce Reed. So, to be clear, it includes the people that are otherwise the ones telling the New York Times how these lists were created. That in and of itself raises a certain amount of question marks. Another, on the evening of January 19th, his final night as president, was with Mr. Siskel, Mr. Reed, and 3 other top aides, Anthony Bernal, Steve Ricchetti, and Annie Tomasini. And I apologize for any mispronunciations of any of those. The emails show that Mr. Biden added the preemptive pardons for his family at the January 19th meeting on his last day in office. They also suggest that he changed some of his thinking. The summary of the first meeting said Mr. Biden had decided to grant a pardon to Don Siegelman, a former Democratic governor of Alabama who was convicted in 2006 of federal corruption charges. The summary of the second said the president had decided to rescind his approval of a pardon for Mr. Siegelman. Notably, President Barack Obama was heavily lobbied to pardon Mr. Siegelman and never did. A whole bunch of stuff on the specifics here. I'm not interested in the policy as much as I am in the question of whether or not this was done of his own accord. Mr. Biden started that day in South Carolina for a different pardon. At the January 19th meeting, which took place in the Yellow Oval Room of the White House residence, Mr. Biden kept his aides until nearly 10 p.m. to talk through such decisions. And again, you can see they're trying to frame this particular concept as, all right, he's deeply invested in the conversations. He's going late into the night on these important issues. The emails show that an aide to Mr. Siskel sent a draft summary of Mr. Biden's decisions at that meeting to an assistant to Mr. Zients, copying Mr. Siskel at 10:03 p.m. The assistant forwarded it to Mr. Reed and Mr. Zients, asking for their approval, and then sent a final version to Ms. Feldman, copying many meeting participants and aides at 10:28 p.m. And this is a weird bit of language. What do you mean copying many? Don't you mean copying all meeting participants? Why in the world would you copy many meeting participants? You are not helping kill the conspiracy, New York Times. As we read this article, we are more and more concerned that this wasn't approved in the appropriate way. Then, to really put that to bed, not so much, 3 minutes later, Mr. Zients hit reply all and wrote, I approve the use of the Autopen for the execution of all of the following pardons. And again, that's the email you want from President Biden. The reason the New York Times is highlighting this is that's what they were looking for. That's the language they need. But not from Mr. Zients, who wasn't elected to anything, but from Mr. Biden, who was elected president of the United States. And so this entire article winds up being read by a not terribly conspiracy-minded person and myself as, okay, so now I think something really did happen, and there really was an issue with the use of mechanical signatures, and that President Biden wasn't a part of these conversations as much as he should have been, and that Mr. Zients probably has some answers to be had in front of Congress or otherwise for all of this, because this doesn't appear to meet even the minimal expectations of a first-year associate at a law firm in Michigan, let alone out of the office of the head of counsel of the White House of the United States of America. So that's what I see as we go through this article. I'm not terribly inclined to believe there are significant issues or conspiracies or any of the viral memes you see on these things. And yet, reading the New York Times, perhaps the most sympathetic outlet that you could have, talk about this particular issue, leads me to say, okay, feels like there's actually something there. This spring, Ed Martin, a Trump loyalist who was then the interim U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, sent letters to Mr. Biden's former aides asking for more information about Mr. Biden's role in the pardon decisions. Mr. Martin's nomination for that role later collapsed in the Senate, and he has since become the Justice Department's pardon attorney. Some more on the Trump investigations. The executive branch investigation led to the Trump administration's request for all those emails we talked about earlier, and that we've only seen a few dozen of, but didn't get what we were looking for, about clemency issues from the Biden White House near the end of Biden's term. Many of Mr. Biden's allies and aides dismissed the investigations as baseless, but the investigations have entangled a sprawling group of former Biden administration officials, and they have enlisted a flight of white shoe lawyers from around Washington. The firms, some of which are performing the work at no cost, aka pro bono, include Latham & Watkins, Covington & Burling, Cooley, and Steptoe, according to people familiar with the matter. And again, law firms, they have attorney-client privilege. They can't necessarily say who their clients are on these kinds of things. So according to people familiar with the matter, doesn't raise the same kind of eyebrows as it does earlier in the article. But I do note that those are big law firms. Those are big, expensive, very expensive law firms. And they are invested in this because there is a lot of political light and heat on this particular issue, and they would prefer to be involved in this if they can. New York Times then talks a little bit about some of the earlier executive orders that Trump did with respect to some of these law firms. And I don't think there's actually anything more I wanted to pull from this because this is all talking about the Trump investigation, except for the last sentence. Mr. Biden granted Hunter Biden a full pardon in December 2024. It was the only clemency warrant in that period that Mr. Biden signed with his own hand. And so I think they note that because it's clear that Mr. Biden had the capacity to sign things with his own hand if he wanted to. It was clearly very important for him to get the pardon to his son, Hunter Biden, at the very end of his term. And maybe not as important to get that signed in person for these other pardons and clemencies. But I do want to say that that's not as important as whether or not he actually assented to them in full in his own capacity and didn't otherwise have his aides and others running around using the power of the presidency for their own purposes, whatever they might have been. And I say that because digital signatures, mechanical signatures, all of these things are okay. We talked about this earlier in the episode, and I brought up a random kind of legal summary here. Don't take this as legal advice. I didn't research this separately, but it just points out what I've said earlier, which is that electronic signatures are frequently used to execute contracts and agreements in the United States. It absolutely is. I just had an entire electronic minute book signed by a client using Adobe Sign. Are e-signatures valid as handwritten signatures? Yes. E-signatures are legally binding and enforceable on most documents to the same extent as handwritten ones. Some exceptions in some states may include wills and trusts, government or court documents, and others, but this depends on the state. They then go through and summarize various things. What is important about the electronic signature process? The following conditions must be met. There must be an intent to sign. The individual must show a clear intention to sign the document. Again, that's the statement that you got from the lawyer and not from the president that the New York Times was looking for, that says, yes, I've looked this over, use the Autopen. That's all you need. You need that audit trail. You need that in writing to show that this is all valid. The individual must show a clear intention to sign the document. This can be demonstrated by clicking a sign button, typing a name, using a stylus, or applying a digital certificate. There must be a way to associate the electronic signature with the individual who signed. This may involve audit trails, authentication processes, or use of secure technology platforms. Now, I'm using this to talk about signing in general. This does not apply to the President of the United States. We don't really have policies and laws governing what the signature process is at that high a level. This is for other contracts in the various states of the United States. When is an electronic signature not acceptable? And I highlight this list because the various states in the United States have a set of documents that we don't accept mechanical or digital signatures for, basically because they are either so important to matters like court orders or official court documents, or have such a high risk of abuse by someone in the room, like wills and testamentary trusts, that we don't want to allow for a mechanical or other signature to otherwise evidence consent, because we need the actual person, the mind, the human being behind the consent to sign off on what we call in the law a wet signature of the document. So wills, testamentary trusts, that's because we worry about the cognition and the ability to make decisions of the elderly and the infirm, and that's what's at issue in this particular area. Maybe we need more statutes on the books. Maybe we need a constitutional amendment, which isn't going to happen, so we probably shouldn't go down that road too long. But either way, you can see on its face what problems a mechanical device presents in this particular circumstance of, is this person infirm? Can they actually assent cognitively to what we are putting in front of them? And if we have a mechanical device that can otherwise show that they did, then we have this whole auditing proof problem, because we don't know what was exercised by the actual authority of the President of the United States and what wasn't. And unfortunately, the New York Times, in trying to defend the Biden administration with the interview and saying that Biden says that he did all of these things, only raised, I think, 1,000 more questions for anybody that is reading these topics carefully. I hope you are reading these topics carefully. I don't have a particular position on whether President Biden did these various things as he suggests that he did in his interview with the New York Times. All I can talk about as a lawyer is that at bare minimum, the process here is very sloppy and raises more questions than it answers. And I think that's about what I wanted to talk about. The other thing is with respect to straw men. So, what is a straw man fallacy? You've probably seen this term all around the internet. If you've been on social media for more than 5 minutes, you'll see people accusing other people of using straw men. But this summary here from Scribber says, it's a distortion of someone else's argument to make it easier to attack or refute. Instead of addressing the actual argument of the opponent, one may present a somewhat similar but not equal argument. So, the Republicans, Donald J. Trump and his allies, as the New York Times put it, are arguing that President Biden didn't have the cognitive facility to actually make the decisions that he says that are said to have been his decisions towards the end of his term. That's what they are arguing. And then they say the Autopen allows an avenue for bad actors in his office to do what they want under his name, and that's a bad thing, and that those actions should probably be invalid. The straw man here is that the Autopen itself is the problem, right? You see the New York Times actually report on this in various ways, how an Autopen conspiracy theory about Biden went viral. A specious theory, meaning one without foundation, on pardons had help from the Conservative Heritage Foundation before President Trump and right-wing influencers amplified it. Mr. Howell, executive director of the Oversight Project, a branch of the Conservative Heritage Foundation, sensed an opportunity, he said in an interview. For months, he had been comparing Mr. Biden's signature on dozens of official documents and noting that many of them appeared identical. Before boarding his flight, Mr. Howell made a conspiratorial post on X. Whoever controlled the Autopen controlled the presidency. While critics of Mr. Biden question his fitness for office, no evidence has emerged that he did not consent to any of the acts bearing his signature. Now, again, that might be. No evidence has emerged that he did not consent, but that is not the same as evidence has emerged that he did consent. And that's what the New York Times was looking for in the article we just went over in this episode. And that's one of the things that really raises a red flag to me, that they don't appear to be able to show that. Yet by the time Mr. Howell landed, his post had gone viral. Within days, the notion that shadowy deep state operatives had been secretly running the country instead of Mr. Biden, using a mechanical contraption to achieve their diabolical aims, had erupted into a furor. And I have no doubt that there are more conspiracy-minded individuals out there that look at this whole thing and say, yes, the demons ran the White House and it was all evil and it was all bad and it was all just done by Autopen. And there's certainly going to be people out there that take things to extremes and run too far with it. That's what the New York Times is categorizing here. You see them follow up on it with Trump orders investigation of Biden and his aides. This is from early June. You see June 4th, 2025. This is when an executive order went out from the president's office, put the power and the resources of the federal government to work, examining whether some of Mr. Biden's presidential actions were legally invalid. And again, to the credit of the New York Times, they are focused on the right question there. Was there assent? Was there a meeting of the minds? Did the actual person in authority make the decision? That's the question, not whether a mechanical device was used. And yet, when we turn to things like NBC News, we see articles like the following just a day ago. Lead investigator into Biden's use of an Autopen signed letters with a digital signature. House Oversight Committee Chair Representative James Comer, Republican, Kentucky, used a digital signature to send out letters and subpoena notices related to the Biden Autopen investigation. Representative James Comer has been leading the probe into Joe Biden's cognitive state during his presidency, with Republicans alleging that Biden's occasional use of an Autopen to sign documents, a practice other presidents have done as well, demonstrated that he wasn't fully in control or aware of what his administration was doing. Now, we just talked about all the issues here. I know you're all in the comments listening to me talk about these various things. Do you think that was the argument that was raised? That the Republicans, Donald J. Trump and his allies, are saying that the use of the occasional Autopen to sign documents demonstrated that he wasn't fully in control? No, the argument that was made, as the New York Times acknowledges, is that President Trump, during and after his debate with Biden, and certainly as part of his demeanor in general, says President Biden didn't know what he was doing, and the use of the Autopen helps facilitate that. Not that the use alone makes those things invalid. But documents show that some of the letters and subpoena notices Comer had sent out in connection to his investigation have been signed using a digital signature. Oh my, heaven forfend. Trump and his allies have repeatedly pushed the Autopen theory to undermine Biden and his policies. In June, Trump ordered an investigation into the matter and said it was one of the most dangerous and concerning scandals in American history. Comer's committee has taken up Trump's push in Congress. He has sent 16 letters to former Biden White House officials requesting transcribed interviews. In all 16 of those letters, metadata reveals his signature was a digital picture inserted into the letter. Yes, if you're signing letters at all in the year of our Lord 2025, chances are you're using a digital signature. Certainly the engagement letters and other signed documents that I send out are using a picture of my signature. That is not a grand conspiracy of really any kind. In addition to the 16 letters requesting voluntary appearances, Comer sent letters to former White House physician Dr. Kevin O'Connor and Anthony Bernal, who served as a senior aide to then First Lady Jill Biden, forcing them to appear via subpoena. The cover letters for the subpoenas were both signed with digital images, rather than Comer writing out his name by hand, what's known as a wet signature, which we talked about. While the committee released copies of the letters, it released only a photo of the actual subpoena, which does appear to show a wet signature from Comer. A look at the metadata of the letters shows that they were created by someone besides Comer. Surprise, surprise. And hovering over Comer's signature in Adobe Acrobat shows that it is a digital image. Yep. This is all great investigative work from NBC News. Using digital signatures for official correspondence is a common practice for both Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives. Chairman Comer has never hidden the fact that he uses a digital signature when appropriate, and he approves all official correspondence that is signed digitally, right? That's the important part here, right? This is the NBC News fighting a straw man, saying it's just the use of digital or mechanical signatures that's a problem. That is not the case. And this is the kind of thing that exposes the political biases of outlets. And again, I don't have a problem with these outlets being biased. Every human being on earth is biased in one manner or another, and we cannot pretend otherwise. But it shouldn't be the case that you're just out there fighting straw men like they are here, saying that, oh, the use of the digital or mechanical signature was the problem. That's what Trump and his allies say. That is not what they say. What their problem is with this part at the end, which is that Comer approves all official correspondence that is signed digitally. Did President Biden? We don't know. I would love to say yes. There's a complete chain of evidence, a direct line of authority that you can use to say this is what happened. But certainly the existence of mechanical and digital signatures allows for a bad actor to exist, and it's not completely outside the pale to suggest that this seems to be a circumstance where a bad actor could have operated in the shadows if they were so inclined. The practice extends beyond just digital copies of signatures on electronic documents. For years, congressional offices have designated staffers to sign on behalf of the members to alleviate the burden. And again, like we talked about before, with respect to signing something at the diner where you buy your burger and fries, as long as you are assenting to the signature, you can sign it with a My Little Pony character, you can sign it with a star or a heart, you can send your 4-year-old nephew or niece up to sign on your behalf, as long as there's a direct line of you assenting to it. And these are for things far less important than federal pardons and commutations. Comer has acknowledged that using an Autopen is acceptable at times, but he said it should not be used for legal documents. And again, this is his own kind of standard, not a specific legal one. Presidents use the Autopen just like I use an Autopen, or Representative Jim Jordan or anyone else in Congress, to sign correspondence to the massive amounts of messages that you get. But no one uses an Autopen for legal documents. I can't use an Autopen to sign a subpoena. That's my legal document, subpoenas. I have to fly back to Washington, D.C. just to sign one piece of paper. Again, that's essentially a personal standard. There are certain instances where the government or courts will demand a wet signature, but for the most part, the world has moved on from that particular demand. Biden himself has pushed back on any assertions that he was not in control of the decisions made in the White House, even the ones that were certified with an Autopen signature. In an interview with the New York Times, Biden said the reason the Autopen was used was because of the volume of clemency requests the administration was dealing with. I made every decision, he told the Times last week. That's the article we read earlier. We're talking about a whole lot of people. I think the American people are far more concerned about what Trump has to hide about his connections to Jeffrey Epstein than Biden's legal use of the Autopen, a practice enjoyed by Comer, Trump, and virtually every elected official in Washington, said a Biden White House official. I guess former Biden White House official. I don't know what the title is after the fact. Conservatives in Trump's MAGA coalition have been demanding more documents from the investigations into Epstein. And again, NBC News just goes off on a tangent here, right? We were talking about Autopens. We're talking about Biden. We're talking about clemency. Now we're going to talk about Epstein Island. Thank you, YouTube. I'm sure you've already demonetized or done whatever else you're going to do to this video just for saying those words. But it's NBC News that decided to take the swift swerve into Epstein land. There is precedent for sending letters with digital signatures like the ones Comer is sending. Sure, because they're totally effective. Most of the ones sent to investigatory targets in the January 6th Select Committee investigation were signed digitally, and committee staff argued the chairman is adhering to a long-held congressional standard. But Democrats argued that the same standard exists in the White House, and Comer picking and choosing when he physically signs something is arbitrary at best, yes, basically, and hypocritical at worst. There's really no hypocrisy here. Comer using an Autopen to investigate an Autopen is just so James. And again, politics, right? One of the reasons we don't talk about politics so much in Virtual Legality and Hangouts and Headlines is because everybody on every side tends to do this kind of thing, right? Comer is not using an Autopen. Comer is using a digital signature. An Autopen is a mechanical device. But it doesn't matter because I'm trying to make my point in a political soundbite. So I'm going to say it like this, and it's going to be featured on NBC News, and a winner is me. But it doesn't help for understanding. It doesn't help to get to the bottom of the truth of these particular issues. And it's one of the reasons I generally avoid topics like this one in this context, but I didn't think that we could just skip this after I read the article. House Oversight Republicans are attempting to prove that the use of the Autopen was directly connected to Biden's not being aware that something was being signed on his behalf. At this point, the committee has not specifically said what, if any, documents would fall in that category, and they still have yet to reveal evidence that would back up their theory. And again, the evidence of absence is not the same as the absence of evidence. And yet, when we look at the New York Times article, it surely seems like there's a hole in what would be normal operating procedure for any signing of any legal document of any importance, let alone perhaps the most important documents in the land. A source with direct knowledge of the committee's work told NBC News that the focus of their witness interviews had been to understand the process by which the decisions were made, etc., etc. Various memos would happen, and that's the end of the article. But this is the straw man, right? This is, you used a digital signature, just like you're accusing Biden of using an Autopen, when the Autopen is not the issue here, folks. What is at issue is whether or not President Biden was cognizant of the things that were being done in his name, in his office, and I think there is at least more question behind that now than there was before we started and before this article was written. All right, that's Hangouts and Headlines for today. We are finishing at a pretty good time here. I will make sure to get any more comments or other member or super chat notices that I can put up here on screen. Brentwood Chic, good to see you. Thank you for becoming a YouTube member of the channel. I really appreciate all the support here. Because I haven't done this in a while, I didn't actually pull up the page that says check on super chats and send memberships and all these various other things for support. So just know that if you want to support conversations like this, I very much appreciate it. They can't happen without you. And I appreciate all of the chats, comments, and otherwise. If you want to leave comments to this video after the fact, everything that you can do to tell YouTube that you pay attention to this and that you like this content is going to be helpful for getting more of this content made and seen by more people at YouTube. So thank you, Brentwood Cheek, for being a member. And I will catch any other comments and questions that anybody else has as best I can as part of this conversation. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Let's see what else we've got. All right, let's see. Witness Multi-Chick says gaslighting on a national level. Concerned emoji. Thanks, Hoeg. Blue heart. Scales of justice emojis. Yes, I think there is a certain amount of, I wouldn't necessarily frame it as gaslighting insofar as I don't know that it's intentional in every case, but there is a lot of writing to agendas from all parts of the political spectrum. If I had pulled up a Fox News article, I'm sure that I could find a different bit of writing that was also ridiculous in the other direction. It was just that these were the things I saw when I was doing the research for this video. But that's a problem with the conversation. That's one of the reasons Hangouts and Headlines exists, is I want folks to be able to read articles as closely as I do and to look at these various things and say, okay, what are the agendas in this particular circumstance and what am I not seeing, right? I am not sitting here and telling you that Biden didn't know anything that was going on. I'm telling you that that possibility exists in a bigger and broader way than it did before this article existed. And that concerns me legitimately. Tony P says, thanks for hosting this great discussion. Thanks, Tony P. I hope that we continue to have a great discussion in the comments after the fact. I love responding to everybody that talks about these things with me. One of the reasons I like to make these videos is to have a space where I know reasonable minds can differ, perhaps strongly, on some of these issues, while also having a good conversation in those comments. A lot of you participate in those. Please do after the fact. And please don't feel obligated to do anything like a super chat or a membership, especially if you're not in a good position to in 2025. Believe me, I know how the economy is right now. So thank you for being here. That's certainly more than enough. Sharing these videos and this channel with friends and family that people might be interested in. All of that helps as well. So thank you so much. Ender Buckley says, also keep that in mind with entertainment reporting. Yes, usually that's the way my channel works, is I talk about silly stuff and then say, look at this. And now think about this particular framework, the way this is written, the way these decisions are made about what to write about, and have it apply to something more serious, like politics, like the governance of your country or other jurisdiction, what have you. This case, we're doing it a little bit opposite, right? I could have done a Hangouts and Headlines on the Superman box office numbers and how those have been reported on over this past weekend. Because while I enjoyed the movie Superman, a lot of those articles are taking, let's say, they are taking a wide brush on the reality of the box office returns for that movie compared to its immediate successor. And I could have talked about that and then said, look at how you can fake this reporting and how it matters to more important things. But in this case, we're going the opposite direction. And I appreciate everybody keeping a cool head as far as I can tell in the chat and comments. I know I was on a roll talking about things in the middle there of that episode, but Tide, let me know if there were any issues after the fact. Otherwise, I really very much appreciate people having good and reasoned conversations about topics of supreme importance to all of us, even if we're very passionate about one side or the other on these things. Sunder Keenan says it feels like this discussion also highlights the relevance of whether or not governmental actors are meaningfully assenting anyway, given the known public tendency to sign things not fully understood. Well, sure. I mean, to the extent that you want to apply, hey, people aren't reading the end user license agreements in their favorite video game, to maybe the president isn't understanding everything that's written in his executive orders or his pardon pronouncements or what have you, there's probably a conversation that could be had around just the general cognizance of contract terms in and of themselves. I don't know if we want to break it down that far, but certainly when we read the executive orders that the Trump administration has put out at just a volume that is insane, it is clear that he didn't write those all himself. He's assented to the concepts, but does he understand the middle paragraphs of page 7? I would guess not. So that's certainly a conversation to be had as well. Tide says the chat did good. I so appreciate you, chat, and I so appreciate you, Tide. So thank you for being here. But I was worried about having any of these topics to discuss because the internet is a horrible hellscape from which there is no escape. And so often you have a conversation that remotely touches on any of these concepts go terribly wrong because people are not listening to each other. They're setting up their own straw men. They're fighting them. It's all very entertaining, I'm sure, for some people, but I prefer to try to get as close to the truth as possible as we can in a YouTube video format. And I very much appreciate chat being as awesome about that as they are. Thank you, Tide, for letting me know. I never know how to pronounce this one. Laria says, happy to see another Hangouts and Headlines. Money for the T Fund. Thank you. Yes, I was losing my voice a little bit in the middle. Again, if I don't do these often enough, one of the reasons I want to do them more often is because I forget what my standard protocols are for making sure like I don't just hack up a lung live on stream here. But I did at least remember to make a tea for myself this morning, so that's good. Thank you for the help for the tea fund, Liara. I really appreciate it. Ender Buckley says, like with the Stan Lee case. Yeah, sure. Stan Lee, other things in the Midwest. I'm sorry, I grabbed that from the chat. Someone commented on my accent. Larea is the correct pronunciation. Yes, I wanted to just say entertainment definitely has various stories that happen that aren't giving you the full picture of things, and you have to start evaluating what direction people might be coming from on all this stuff. The reason I was potentially going to bring up the Superman cases is there's essentially political groups that are backing the James Gunn DC Comics universe and the Zack Snyder DC Comics universe. None of that is important, but it's still the same kind of tribal mechanics and reporting that you see in more important stuff like national politics. David Bernard says Trump and Biden are measured with different moral yardsticks. If these concerns were voiced versus Trump, they would be shouted down. Well, I think that these concerns would be shouted down in various corners against Biden or Trump, right? That's one of the problems we have. When I say reasonable minds can differ is the watchword of the channel, it's because somebody differing with you cannot just be assumed to not have a reasonable mind. That's the purpose of that statement. And yet, so many people do, right? I'm no big fan of the various presidents of the United States that have existed in my lifetime. And yet somebody might read this video and say, oh, there's that Trump nut then shouting down President Biden and giving voice to the conspiracy theories about the Autopen, etc. Like, the internet will do what the internet will do. One of the things I had to get over in making content over the last year was the notion that I could be perfect and get a message out that could not be misconstrued by anyone anywhere. And I know that sounds silly and it's ridiculous. Nobody can achieve that end. And yet one of the things that was really pushing me down over the past little while was that I was seeing my comments and what I hoped would be positive contributions to discourse being used in ways that were exactly the opposite of what I intended to convey as a message. And that led me to be very reticent about contributing to the internet conversation at all. I'm trying to get over that. That's part of my process here at this point. And I'm trying to do that with things that are very important that I think I can offer something of value to conversing about. So I appreciate it, but I do think that right now you have tribal mentalities on both sides. Politics is where you see it very prominently. You also see it in stupid places like Superman. You see it in stupid places like video game consoles or specific video games or any other piece of media. And yet, I do want to be a part of this conversation. I enjoy conversing with all of you. I love Hangouts as much as I love the headlines. It's why it's Hangouts and headlines. And so I very much appreciate all of you making the comments here today, including Amazing Meta. Thank you for the super chat. Just for the love of all things Hangouts and headlines. By the way, the E in my name is a long E. Amazing Meta. I apologize for that. Thank you for letting me know. I will try to remember for next time. I cannot promise it, but I will do my best. The E in your name, the A in your name is a long E. Oh, Medi. Okay, I'm going to mispronounce it 6 different ways now, so I apologize for that. Thank you so much for the super chat. James Randolph says, I just like how when I criticize one party, people assume that means I like the other party. One of the funniest things for me personally, because I don't care about this so much, that I have seen in my own contributions to the conversation is how true this notion is. And I don't see it with politics a lot because I don't talk about politics a lot, but I do see it with video games a lot. Right? So when I say Microsoft's acquisition of Activision should not be challenged on antitrust grounds, people read that as defending Microsoft, being a big Xbox fan, and being against all things Sony and Nintendo. When I say the Nintendo end user license agreement doesn't do what IGN or someone else is reporting it to be doing, then people say, oh, you're just a Nintendo bot. You're just a Mario stan, whatever else people are going to call Nintendo fans. I don't know. And you're against everything else. When I say something against Sony, they'll say you hate Sony, you're for Microsoft or otherwise, right? That's just what they do. And it's the most recent thing. Doesn't matter that I have more than 1,000 videos on this channel talking about all sorts of different things, right? It doesn't matter. It's the most recent thing. It'll be, oh, clip this guy. He's just in the pocket of big Microsoft. It's like, no. I have nothing to do with Microsoft at all, including since my brother has been laid off from Microsoft most recently. So if you want to accuse me of things, it would be, I guess, holding a grudge. But that's not really the way I roll either. So yes, this is entirely true. I hate it. I hate it to death, James Randolph. I hope this space is never that for you. That is not what I want to see here. Reasonable minds can differ on all these points. Reasonable minds can come in and say, Hoeg, you're wrong because you didn't take this into account. And if you identify really, I love that because I always want to be getting better at this and other things. So please do let me know. Senator Keenan says it's just basic respect to defend correct things done by people you don't like, as there's generally enough to criticize where it is deserved. Yeah, I think so. I think my feeling has always been if you do like someone, then you want to criticize them when it's obvious that criticism is warranted because you want to cash that political capital or social capital or whatever else we're talking about. Say, look, I am an honest broker. We can be honest about this. This person that I like did a bad thing, and we should talk about that. Or this person that I don't like did a good thing, right? There's that meme online that says the worst person in the world just made a good point, right? And it's that picture of that guy. I think people probably know what I'm talking about. But that's really, really important to go and say it's not just ad hominem. It's not just the person making the statement. Yes, you're a bad guy. I don't like you. But that right there, that's a good point. It's a point that I hadn't thought about. It's something that is a perspective that I need to incorporate into my own thinking. And even if you're a terrible person, we can learn from each other even on that score. And Ender Buckley says, I have a list of Democrats who always get the smoke because they voted against disability rights enforcement in 2018. Got to hold some lines. I think we all have to judge for ourselves what quote unquote lines we want to hold on these various things. But you can absolutely keep your black list or your white list or your grudge list or whatever else and keep that in mind. If I had that kind of relationship with anybody that I was talking about in this space, I would mention it to you. If you go back to looking at my coverage of the early days of the Justin Baldini, Blake Lively fight, one of the things I say a couple of times is that I'm no fan of Ryan Reynolds. I don't have a really good reason for that. I never got a good vibe from him. But I try to say that in those videos because I want people to understand that I'm going to try to treat it honestly, but I do have that internal tilt that I can recognize, and that you might come into those comments and say, well, I can say Rick is treating this in a way that he wouldn't necessarily for another if he didn't have that bad vibe. But even after I disclosed that, and I said that because I thought that was important to disclose, some people came into the comments to those videos and said, well, you're so biased against Ryan Reynolds and you're just out there making hay it shouldn't exist. And why are you doing these various things? And I said, well, the reason I stated that at all was to establish that I did have this tilt away from him as part of that story. You should be in favor of people disclosing those things. I'm not trying to hide it, but I think if you actually look at what I say about the topic, you'll see that I try to treat everybody fairly. That's something that is a bit of nuance that I think people are still grappling with, at least in my space online. So I try, but I'm not perfect at it. Nobody's perfect at anything in this world. But if I had that kind of circumstance with Joe Biden or Donald Trump or anyone else, I would try to articulate it. I think there are even executive orders and laws that you see from the first Trump administration, which was pretty early in the days of this channel, where I say certain things about, I don't love the way this was framed. I don't love how this behavior is demonstrated in this particular circumstance. And I try to let you know that when it happens. All right. So I think that's our episode of Hangouts and Headlines today. We had a great conversation both before and after the headlines. I think we had a great conversation on the headlines. Please do share this out around with anybody you think might be interested. Leave super chats. Join as a member. We're going to try to do more streams here. I'm currently aimed at maybe getting out in front of you once a week on my own channel, as opposed to on Bitcast or on Last Stand Media content. But I am on a lot of that. If you're at all interested in video games, I was on a 5-hour podcast about the recent Xbox layoffs for Defining Duke at Last Stand Media that I think went live for everybody on their YouTube channel on Sunday. I think it was a really good conversation. You can hear me monologue a bit if that's why you come to the channel. I have one of those at Last Stand. Please do check it out. Otherwise, have a great day, and don't let Biden or Trump or anybody else get you down. Thanks. See you on the next one.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.